Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to an exciting book discussion on The New Global Possible, Rebuilding Optimism in the Age of Climate Crisis. We're in for a treat today with a fireside chat between two luminaries in the climate space, Ani Dasgupta and Jennifer Morgan. They will talk for the first half, then take your questions via the Q&A buttons you see on your screen. Quick introductions, even though you probably know them both. Jennifer is a globally recognized leader in international climate policy and diplomacy. She most recently served as the State Secretary and Special Envoy for International Climate Action for Germany's Federal Foreign Office. During her tenure, she was instrumental in securing key global outcomes, including the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund and the historic decision to justly transition away from fossil fuels, both of which appear in the book. Jennifer is currently a senior fellow at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and a fellow at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. Ani is president and CEO of World Resources Institute, where he spearheads global efforts to drive system change for people, nature, and climate. A widely recognized leader in climate policy and finance, sustainable cities, and poverty alleviation, Ani has been president of WRI since 2021. Before that, he spent 7 years as global director of the WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities and previously served more than 2 decades at the World Bank. Today's conversation stems from Ani's new book, The New Global Possible, which you can buy wherever books are sold. And a quick plug that the audiobook will be available on November 4th on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, and more. With that, Jennifer, over to you.
Thanks, Lauren. And hi, Ani. How great to be here with you today. And congratulations on the book. In reading it, it was good for the soul. And because in these moments of, all that's happening in the world right now, I think it's hard to be optimistic. So I'm curious, how can you be optimistic? How do you balance kind of this sense of the urgency, all the impacts that are happening around the world, and the crises, and offer this narrative of optimism without seeming naive?
Yeah, first of all, Jennifer, I'm so happy we're doing this together. Thank you very much. It's just wonderful. It is, I mean, there is no sugarcoating it. It is a really tough moment. It was tough moment year back. It's actually a tougher moment right now, what's we're seeing across the world. However, when I became CEO about in the middle of the pandemic and 4 years back, I remember this was just before Glasgow. We were all disappointed at the speed of things that are happening since Paris. Paris was such a euphoric moment. So disappointment of the speed was already there. So I was asking myself, what should be WRI doing at this moment? Or what should I be doing? And in that process, I ended up talking to 100 plus people who've been part of this movement for 30 years. You were one of them. And those conversation led me actually surprisingly optimistic for a few different reasons. And the book is a result of these conversations. There all these different chapters of the book are different conversations I've had. And the optimism comes from, I think, a few different things. One is the recognition that the movement has done enormously important things in the last 30 years that we just take for granted. That we didn't know how to count carbon 20 years back. Now, the thing that we are going to talk about, I hope today also, about what countries call NDCs, they didn't exist. That innovation that came from the Mexico COP is an enormous innovation to happen to what led to Paris. But the first thing was we have done big things collectively, and we can do much bigger things. So that was my first thrust. But three very specific things leads to me my overall optimistic view about the long-term future. Three things. One is since Paris, the market has delivered enormous technological gains for the transition that we even faster than we expected when we were in Paris. We all know about solar and wind, but it's not just solar and wind. I mean, look at batteries. We thought even 4 years back, batteries would be the biggest barrier. Batteries are 10 times cheaper than it was 3 years back. Just 2 months back, CATL, one of the big battery manufacturers, announced it'll be 10 times cheaper than today in a few months. So just an example, things we used to call, or still call, hard to abate sector, cement, steel, glass, that were high heat. Even those, thought we won't find solution. So bigger point I'm making is that technology is being delivered at a speed faster than we expected. Electric cars is a great example. Many more innovation is needed, especially on food systems. Many more. I'm not saying, but I think the market is delivering technology. But what the big observation I have, and the point I make throughout the book, is that technology itself is not enough.
Mm.
Only when we combine technology to actually orchestrating change that produces an outcome, a good that is low carbon, good for people, good for nature, then only that it matters. And we are not doing that well. We are not doing orchestrating well. We are just so consumed by the technological silver bullet that we are not, and that is the whole point that we need to learn orchestrating. And the book has 60 stories when we have done orchestration better. And the third point is that when we take technology and orchestration together and do things in climate towards a better climate or better nature, and it's actually good for people, and this is a very important point in the book. It has to be good for people, and that's the trick. It's not easy always for long-term policy to be good for people immediately, but when it's good for people, those changes have been very durable. And that is what we need to learn about how to do climate action that is actually good for people. So there's political support, durable political support for the change. And that's where my optimism come. I also want to say I live in the United States, and United States is right now an outlier in its government's policies against climate. Outlier. And even it's not the United States the only country that's having a backlash. A lot of countries in Northern Europe having, but it's an outlier. But in WRI, we work across the world. And in the large middle income countries across the world, which I think will be really the dominant force going forward in climate,
Mm.
their point of view is very different. They're not having a backlash. They're not doing fast enough, I think. But and I hope we talk about this, those countries gives me a lot of optimism for them. It makes economic sense, industrial sense, economic growth sense to actually become low carbon and nature positive. We are already seeing that.
Mm. No, that makes a huge amount of sense. I mean, I think this question of orchestrating change is a really important one. I think in the lead up to Paris, we did a good job of orchestrating change, and it doesn't just happen out of the air. It requires resources, it requires trust. But I'm curious, when you talk about orchestrating change, what do you mean by that? Can you get practical? You said there's examples in the book. Like, what's a real world example for you on that?
Yeah, I think I want all the listeners to know that Paris just didn't happen in Paris, though it was an incredible outcome. And Jennifer was very central to the lead up. So I'm going to ask you a question after I respond to your
Yeah,
question, because
sure.
the first chapter is about Paris, and the chapter argues how did we get to Paris? Why was it successful? And I would want to come back to you were the central player there. My sense of what I write about orchestration, let me give you two very different examples, is that we are too focused on what to do and not how to get it done, how to produce an outcome. Give you an example, in 2003 and 4, when solar and wind energy became commercially viable, and we started having solar and wind projects at a very small scale, and it was clear it was a better technology. It was durable. It didn't need. It had upfront costs, but did not need any fuel which is incredible compared to fossil fuel energy supply, which needs fuel all the time. So people realized very quickly that's a better technology. But people argued, we have the great technologies. If we could just get the price right, I mean, the price is lower than fossil fuel, that will be done. Actually, in the next 15 years, by 2018, price was right. Solar and wind today in 2025, in 95% countries across the world, maybe it's 99 right now,
Mm.
producing a unit of solar and wind energy compared to new fossil fuel energy is cheaper, sometimes by far cheaper. Yet, if that is the case, that is the real case today. Is solar and wind happening everywhere, every investment? No. It's only 12% of global energy supply is solar and wind right now. Why not? Why? Because we need land to build these things. We need policies in place. We need financing. We need people, actually qualified people to build this new technology. We need users to agree to change energy sources. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. We need, the biggest failure has been so far, actually, we need a whole different grid to supply that energy into the places. So that's an example of an energy system we are very familiar with, where actually we have been very successful in getting the price right. Also very successful investing in it because it's profitable, but actually a large amount of solar and wind energy doesn't get into the grid and being used. That's an example. But I also want to say there are other very different examples at a different scale. One of my favorite examples from the book is these three women, which I always talk about because I think that's such a great example. Because it's not just energy we need to change. We need to also change how we produce food and how we produce. So this example is I met these three women who run an enterprise just outside Nairobi, and they run a macadamia nut enterprise. They work with 10,000 farmers. They help them grow the trees, help them with technical system when they're sick, but most importantly, buy the macadamia nuts as soon as they're grown and pay them through electronically for the phone immediately as they buy it. So
Mm.
10,000 families are getting income from this process. And then those nuts come to a small factory outside Nairobi where they employ mostly women. The process is sell it to Europe and United States. It's a pretty straightforward but interesting business model where a lot of people who didn't have employment or steady employment getting employed. So immediate benefit for a group of people. But what's interesting about it is that those trees that live for 50 years are being grown on land that is degraded. And Africa actually collect cumulatively has more than 50%, 55 or 50% of their arable land. You can't grow crops or graze animals on it. And getting that land back into use is incredibly economically because 55, 60% of African population is directly connected to land. So these trees are not only sequestering carbon for 50 years, those roots are bringing back water under the ground.
Mm.
And the fascinating thing about what I found is these three women got a small loan from a project we're involved in, but now they don't need loans from a project like us. They're commercially viable. So this is an example of a unit of change that we need to do 1,000 times over. But here they're actually being able to provide benefit to people immediately and long-term benefit to carbon, climate, and nature in the long term. And that creates the engine for change, right? And it's commercially viable. And this is what I find is the kind of solutions we need to do across in different scales. And the book has examples in different scales.
Mhm.
But if
Mhm.
I may ask you, going back to your question of orchestration, Jennifer, you were kind of in the center of the non-government. Now you were government recently, but that time you were center of the non-government part of building up to Paris. How did you see this idea? If you think about a frame of orchestration that I write about, what would you attribute the success to Paris? You were kind of central to it. You were central to Act 2015, their voice, and I write in the chapter how Tony from Marshall Island, a very small country, was instrumental in bringing a voice that wasn't there at that time.
Oh, he sure was. Rest his soul. Um, I think one of the keys going into Paris, and it's more complicated now, but still possible on a lower level, is that we were able early on to identify the goals that we had. We were aiming for an agreement, right? And then we knew, okay, we wanted these long-term goals. This was the Act 2015, which was this project that we did at WRI with other think tanks from all around the world to put forward ideas, not just based on our own analysis, but based on sitting down. My gosh, I think we went to 14 countries in a very short period of time with governments, but also with business, with NGOs, with labor, with mayors, and said, okay, what do you need? What's the function of this global agreement for you? And based on that, we were able, there was an analytical exercise that wasn't just us sitting in our offices, but really working with people and engaging them, also the activists and the government and the business to say, okay, what are we looking for? And I think Paris was a moment, having followed up to Copenhagen, when everyone, and I think we need this now more than ever, was ready to come together, was ready to say, okay, at the end of the day, we know we can't get everything we want. Of course not. We're going to focus in on this. And then we were able to, in a way, align efforts, not coordinate them, because it's too complex. There's too many actors out there. But it was so important, and I think this was an innovation in Lima with Manuel Pulgar Vidal, but also picked up by the French and Christiana Figueres, that the, quote, non-state actors got more involved. And they didn't just get involved in announcing their own thing. We supported them in being able to be involved in the key questions of the negotiations themselves and in setting the expectations in the public domain. So you had different voices coming from all across society, not just one or the other, but in their own way, saying we need this agreement, we need this long-term security, but we need the transparency around it. We need to have strong national commitments. We need the finance for developing countries. Adaptation is a real issue, and so that was part of it. That orchestration of kind of around a common goal, not getting too hung up in the details in this group, but really just setting a narrative and around that piece. And then I think what was so important as well, I was thinking back to it, was I just remember the moment in New York where Avaaz and 350 and Sierra Club made the bold decision to organize the first big climate march before the UN meeting. And we were all super nervous because the fear was nobody was going to show up, and then we're going to and so it was bold to say, no, we're going to do this big march. And it was beautiful and it was powerful because you had the labor unions next to the business CEOs, next to the ministers, but also the youth. My sister came down from Maine with a bus of her students, and was marching with me and someone from the German government.
And it made news. That march made news. I mean, it just made
totally.
It's a big news.
And
I ended up
I
talking to
think it was the
Christiana.
heart
Sorry.
as well. Sorry, and just the last piece of that is I just think I remember looking and seeing the individuals who were also in government who all of a sudden felt supported. They weren't alone. And I think that's a big part of optimism and hope, is knowing you're not alone in these battles that you're going to go in and negotiate.
Yeah, I think for me the Paris outcome, though everyone thinks it's just Paris, it just happened. I mean, I ended up talking to Christiana about this, and she liked this orchestra. She said, I didn't think about it then. It was orchestration, but she wrote a foreword for the book
Yeah.
because she really. But this point you just made, that negotiation, not just between negotiators, it's the orchestration of all the other pieces, the civil society voice, the government, the talking, and she actually led me to Felipe Calderon, because she said, Calderon was the first one. This is a Mexican president who hosted the COP just after the Copenhagen one. That she said she is the first one who kind of thought about this not as a climate problem, but a foreign policy problem, which was kind of interesting observation. And the French did the same, right? They very much deployed their foreign service. So I think that's a very good example. What this point, your question about orchestration, that we need many pieces to come together, and we have to recognize that many pieces have to come together and actively work towards getting those pieces together. And often that doesn't happen.
No, it doesn't. And I think one of the risks today is I observe a very fragmented field. So I think we need to listen to each other more than ever. And I think it is, I think, like as you were saying, we're all concerned about the numbers because of the temperature rise, I think, and that is one reality we need to pay attention to. But also the institutional change and the fact that these national determined contributions have come in, and they are much more robust. They have all greenhouse gases. They have sub targets for renewables, and the 5 year cycle. It's working, and I don't think we should take that for granted. But on the temperature rise, I mean, one thing you talk about in your book is justice, and I think Tony DeBruym was one of the key people, also because he represented what it could be like to lose your entire country, and for people to have to come to terms with that. And I'm wondering right now, my gosh, it's such a hard time. Do you feel like we can make meaningful progress, or how, to get to your how point, how do we make meaningful progress on this? We see public finance going down around the world. Your point, we need to bring down the cost of capital in Africa to get renewables. It's not automatic that it happens. Loss and damage. Um, this topic sometimes gets lost, and I really like the fact that you brought it front and center. But how do we do this now?
You know, I feel justice will become the dominant issue going forward, much more than it has been. And I just want to be clear to our listeners. I mean, there are two very different dimensions of the justice issue in climate. First of all, climate change is just fundamentally it's like a poster child of injustice because climate change is happening everywhere in the world, but people who suffer are people you and I, Jennifer, will not suffer because we have resources to make our homes cooler, or if our basements get flooded, to call a plumber, or even move if the way we live becomes uninhabitable. But that's not the case for majority of population in the world. So people who suffer from climate and will suffer from climate are poor people and vulnerable countries, and that's already the case. It's not
Hmm.
so I think is a central issue for climate change, and the two dimensions of it is between countries. This is what Tony DeBruyn's point, that countries that actually have produced this carbon dioxide and developed over the last 200 years, and well off right now because of the development, are should do something more than the countries that are suffering that did not contribute to it. So there is a moral question here.
Absolutely.
But I also want to point out that this injustice also within countries, because climate change produces scarcity of water, scarcity of land you can live on or grow crops on, scarcity of clean air. The outcome of a climate change impact is scarcity of a resource that you need. And as our 10,000 years of history shows that anytime there's scarcity, poor people suffer most, and that happens everywhere in the world. So we need to see both dimensions. We can't just talk about it. We also have to talk about the countries, what's happening in adaptation, what's they're investing. Um, my argument, so there's a moral argument to do something. My argument in the chapter is yes, there's a moral argument, but there is also a very big self-serving argument everyone should be looking at. And that is what I focus on the chapter, that the self-serving argument is that if these countries, if we do not do um, uh, a just outcome and invest in these countries, it's not just for these countries that we need to protect and reduce climate. Like if the middle income countries or poorer countries do not transition, the world would not transition. Everyone will suffer. So United States walking away from UNFCCC today doesn't protect the United States citizens from climate change at all, because that will happen. And if you think migration is a problem for
Mm.
Europe politics now, just think about it. We are just seeing the beginning of climate migration, and there is climate migration already. The projections are we will have 10 times more climate projection before 2050, if we don't do anything. So I am trying to make a much more I think the moral case is clear and needs to happen, and we have all made the moral case. But if you look at the economic case inside a country and across the world, not focusing on justice and not making these investments is astronomically more expensive for countries within countries and richer countries. So last year, we had about $300 billion physical loss from climate. Physical loss, not death or loss of jobs. Just want to, meaning bridges breaking and things like that, or people not to be able to go to work. Physical loss. And United Nations produced a report 2 years back that'll be about $500 billion to $1 trillion by 2030, 5 years from now.
Wow.
Just to compare that number, Jennifer, last year, all the support from richer countries to less rich countries, World Bank, bilateral, all of that added up to $250 billion. So just last year, the cost of this was higher than all transfer that took place.
Right.
So I just think once we see the numbers and they're exponentially, but it is not. I want to give you an example where this actually the reverse can happen. Bangladesh is a very good example, and I don't think people pay enough attention to what's happening in Bangladesh. Bangladesh today spends 10% of its budget on adaptation. Absolute outlier in the world. Why is that? About 30 or 25, 30 years back, 2003 or 93, I forget the actual date, they had a Category 5 storm,
Hmm.
and that killed hundreds of thousands of people. And this is in the southern part of Bangladesh where most of the poor people live, and this is a common thing. And the government got really criticized of not doing things. So since then, they've successfully done things of, early warning, shelters, but most importantly, women volunteers talking about what to do. Knowledge turns out is the most resilient thing for protecting. And they had another Category 5 storm in 2023, and only 3 people died in a secondary incident, not directly from the storm. So they have had an enormous investment on protecting people, and because that actually has created benefit for people directly, for poor people, that there is political space in Bangladesh to put 10% of their budget on adaptation, which really even rich countries don't do.
No, they don't.
So I do think for us to think differently about benefits from investments, that is a case for Bangladesh, that we need to do. And I also think politically, though, if you look at Europe or United States, where the backlash is most prominent, we are totally not talking about what the migration issues might become if these countries can't grow food or there's no water, things like that.
I mean, we did a national interdisciplinary climate risk assessment, or we commissioned one when I was in the German government, and the German intelligence agency actually did look at these issues, and they found climate to be one of 5 top risks as a whole across the board for Germany, because of factors like this. And I think I agree, though, it's not a mainstream topic in those communities. The other justice piece, Ani, that I think since Paris has taken off, and I always kind of hoped this would be the case, but is legal justice. I think because the attribution science has taken off the way that it has, and you're much more able to make the links between the intensity or the feasibility or the likelihood of a storm, for example, and climate change, then you've just seen this take off in a major way and potentially be leading into more polluter pays schemes where the large carbon polluters, carbon majors, end up having to pay for the damages that they've caused. And there's just thousands of cases, and of course the International Court of Justice case, I think, is really important. Maybe that can also help all countries, including developed countries. I agree with you. Europe is warming, the fastest warming continent, right, on
I mean, look
Earth.
at what happened to Italy this year,
Yeah, and
just this
Spain.
year. Yeah. But I think just on your point on, I just want to, one thing about, about incidence and attribution. I completely agree. I think we are seeing technological innovation that is going to make that attribution much easier, much more pinpointed. Even VWRI just launched a new version of our Global Forest Watch that actually can look at the whole land, all the row crops, watersheds, everything at a 10 square meter or better resolution. But more importantly, Jennifer, we will be able to pinpoint carbon, both positive, how much carbon is actually in any single tree across the world, but also the emissions from different square
Wow.
hectares of land through the satellite emission tracking at an accuracy that wasn't available. So those point you just made about
Mm,
attribution, where is emission coming from, um, will become much better and much more monitorable. And I think we are very invested in actually, as you know very well, that everything we do is public,
yes,
and we're trying to make it as much. So I think we will see a sea change in that. But at the same time, Jennifer, information technology by itself is not enough. It's just a starting point. Governments
absolutely.
have to have policies and platforms for those legal disputes to actually happen.
Yeah,
And that without that, it'll be just data.
that's for sure. So the importance of those institutions, which are under attack uh, in many places, including right now, I would say, in the US, um,
Very much so.
is so important. It's part of change. You have to, and you can never take for granted what you think is just going to stay. And I think that's also a lesson in the climate kind of. I mean, I've been doing this for more than 30 years. I've been to all the COPs, right? And you just have to stay the course. And I
Absolutely.
and despite what's going on, and you can't look away and think, oh, that's been done, that won't get turned back. Well, it could. So stay involved.
No, that's why I think for me, the durability question of policies is very important. And I just want to underline my observation is, and this is, you might be very, very well versed to discuss because you're in the middle of this in Germany till a few months back, that we have to find climate solutions that are directly benefit people
Mhm.
for political durability of the solutions. Because one thing I highlight in the book and is that, we should be all be disappointed where we find ourselves right now, but we cannot be totally surprised where we find ourselves. Because when we came to Paris, we very much thought about it as a climate agreement. And those numbers and things were very important, getting to 1.5, 2 degrees. And you know very well that science is very difficult to translate for widely. It's a very, very intensely important science. And so what we didn't realize is that we are actually signing an agreement for economic transition. Climate is an outcome of the economy we have. And our economy right now is full of hydrocarbons
Yeah.
everywhere, not just in electricity or transportation, everywhere. Fertilizers, plastics, I can name buildings, everything. So the economic transition is basically doing everything slightly differently, not just producing energy differently, doing fertilizing differently, managing land differently, building things differently, producing glass differently, which actually is a much bigger project than just reducing carbon. I mean, that's the
Absolutely.
project we are in. And this 200 years of fossil fuel has been enormously successful. I mean, this has been the biggest growth in low income, child mortality, lowering age, whatever. You can go on every number. It's not equally distributed. I come from India. I know it's not equally
Mhm.
distributed, but it has been collectively the biggest, most successful 200 years, which means that hydrocarbon has had a very good run, fossil fuel.
Absolutely.
And those
Absolutely.
people, when you change the economy, those people, not just the oil and gas company, all the businesses that are connected, they're not just going to pack up and leave.
No, they're going to
They're
fight
going to
like
do their
heck
best. They
to
they
stop
are
it.
doing their best.
They are.
Uh, so we
With
also have to
billions of
see how.
dollars to stop it.
So we also have to see where we are in this economic transition and see it as an economic transition. and talk about it as economic transition. This is why I like I mean not the Brazil's COP leadership, said uh, the we should talk about COP for a minute before we get to
Mm,
question.
mm.
The COP leadership said, which I really like and been influenced all our work, that the headline they want to see is the COP agreed to ambitious that climate is central to the economic transition these countries faces,
Mm.
which is a very positive, I think, a positive move, so that we could talk about the different parts of the economy, what needs to happen, and and I'm sure you will be in Belém in next month actually. So how do you see Belém? I would love to know from an insider, like what are you looking forward to? I mean, there's a lot of noise about we won't reach 1.5 degree, but Belém still will be a very important.
Yeah, it's still very important. And I just want to say, Ani, I really agree with you on the people side of things. I think having the social issues, I think there's two parts of that, and then I'll link it to Belém. I think one is participatory justice. So actually having people be actively engaged in the decision making around the transitions that are happening in society, whether it be a coal transition like happened here in Germany, or in the forests, where you also have interests, because at the end of the day, this is a politically economic question. And so it's not only the economy, it's the politics. And until we have a process where people feel part of it, I think that's one piece of it. And then the other is really that whenever you do a climate policy, I mean, Germany is now at 50% below 1990 levels, right? And it's 60% renewables in its electricity grid. So it's moving along well. However, the minute that it goes into people's homes, I mean, people's cars, it's which is where we are here now. If you don't put the social questions first,
Yes.
you will not get there. And it's not fair to your point about justice as well. So always thinking about how to make sure that if there are costs, they do not hit low income families. And also that you're doing things that are going to increase the affordability for them and the health benefits, all of those types of things. I couldn't agree more. And I think that's something that we need to do a lot more of. And I think the Brazilians are also really trying to put people at the center of this COP. Their Mutirao concept, which is like togetherness and solving problems collectively, I think is a really amazing concept. I mean, because in a way, that's what it's, of course, gets back to the orchestration thing, but you can't orchestrate. You just all have to be knowing that you're not alone and you're moving forward. And it is a very important COP. It's a tough COP. I mean, the geopolitics couldn't be any harder. In the past, I mean, I've now been through three withdrawals of the United States from various agreements, and this one is different. It's not just a passive withdrawal, it's an active um, set of actions to push forward U.S. fossil fuel interests nationally and internationally to avoid the decline. And I think that's really important for people to understand. I think the backlash is from the fossil fuel industry and others is also because of the revolution that's happening in renewables, which we couldn't have imagined 10 years ago. So this year, I think it's different because the rules are done. And so it's not going to be a big loss and damage fund or a big, transitioning away from fossil fuels. And I think it's going to be kind of packages of things coming together, and we have to think them together. So first of all, it's hugely important the leaders come and they send a signal, we're moving forward with Paris, like they did in New York, right?
Yes. Yes.
We're moving forward with Paris. It's in our economic interest. It needs to be just, of course, and we optimally, they would say, we're going to accelerate the implementation, and they would instruct their negotiators to come and actually put forward a way of transition, using uh, finding a way forward to close the gap that we know is going to be there on the temperature, because the NDCs won't add up. I mean, after China's contribution, it was positive, but it was not what I think we had all hoped for, knew was possible. So one thing is that signal. The other is a set of decisions, right, that need to come forward. But just let me just give an example, and then we're gonna Lauren, heads up, I'm coming to you in a second. For example, on energy, so we have the global stock take. It got that just transition and the tripling and the doubling on renewables and efficiency. So, what could go into a decision? For example, the just transition work program decision, which is very important. What could go into an action agenda? Maybe it's something around grids to overcome that, or on storage, or maybe it's a dialogue between consumers and producers of fossil fuels about how to do this because it is so economic. It's an economic transition. And I think thinking that together, that hopefully can provide those proof points. Adaptation, absolutely key. Finance, key. I could talk for a longer time, but I think it's time to turn it over to our audience. And
Yeah,
Lauren,
yeah.
back over to
There's
you.
Lauren. Hey, Lauren.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for putting so many good questions in the chat. I will read a couple and then we'll take another round. So, it seems that the real global crisis of one of trust, without that being established, little positive and lasting will can result. How do we build trust among so many different interest groups, including governments, NGOs, financial institutions, as well as local communities and indigenous peoples? Another question, being optimistic is important, but like hope, it's a noun. I like that. What do we need to do? What we need to do is activate our hope, which to me means courage. What might be some courageous acts, policies, and more that will really lead to transformative change? And then one more question. What gives you confidence that it will be those middle income countries that will drive climate action going forward?
Jennifer, why don't you start with the first one on trust, and I'll come back on the I'll respond to all of them, but the last one is very close to my heart.
Yeah, and it's hugely important. I think on the first one, I think I mean, trust is so important. It's important in so many levels. On the personal level in a negotiation, whether it's a global negotiation um, or something in a country. And I think trust starts with listening and understanding the perspective of the other in order to find common solutions. I think trust in the global sense, as we were just talking about on the national, is also about finance and support. So that if you do jump forward, which I think that's been these coalitions that have moved forward and said, okay, let's create the loss and damage fund, let's do this. Well, then there needs to be the follow-up of the funds, right? And I think now we need to see progress for Belém, for example, on adaptation finance, on a good roadmap. And I think we need some new innovative mechanisms. I'm working a bit with the Global Solidarity Levy Task Force so that we can be getting the funds moving into particularly loss and damage and adaptation. And then the last piece, I think, in this context is walking the walk. So the European Union needs to come forward with a strong NDC. It needs to be a 90% by 2040. Yes, it's hard, but I think I always found in my last job that the reason why countries had trust with me representing Germany was because Germany was working hard to get a way forward and ready to learn to share the lessons, good and bad, with others. So there's a bit of humanity and humility and trust as well.
I just want to build on Jennifer, your point. I think trust is such a good question. It's a critical kind of, and I write about, building trust across the chapters of the book because I talk about this orchestration between different groups of people, businesses, communities, government, regulators, negotiators, and those conversations or orchestration doesn't happen without trust. But I also want to say that trust is built in multiple layers. And Jennifer already mentioned in small groups, smaller platform, people come together, get to know each other. We at WRI end up organizing many such things to bring negotiators together, build businesses together, to build trust among them and across in the international fora. But I also want to say, what I find very much is there needs to be trust inside the country about what the country is can do and cannot do in a global platform. I feel a lot of countries are held back about the negotiated or ambitious outcome, but they think they can't sell it domestically. And that trust between communities, people about what their policies are and their ability to be more ambitious. So trust is not just at a global forum, but also at at a domestic level politically to be able to do courageous thing. And your courageous point is so good, whoever asked that question, because I do think we need courage. We need courage to break through from where we are to the ambitious outcome we are absolutely can have. I'm absolutely confident we can have a very different outcome than we have today. And for that, it needs courage. It doesn't need blind courage. It needs courage because we're in a transition from an economy to a different economy. It needs courage to politically bring people around to where we are, that we're in the middle of transition. This is what the transition is going to look like, and we're going to do it in a way that does not disrupt people's lives. But the outcome is actually so much better, so much better. We can have abundant carbon-free energy. We can have food that doesn't destroy nature. We can clean air, clean water. But I feel that courage to talk about clearly what this future is and how do we get there is a very big part of the courage part. The last question, if I may, Lauren, about the middle income countries you asked. I think the most important part of the middle income country, this is so just to be clear, we're talking about, India, Indonesia, China, South Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, countries like this, large countries. These countries have most of the population in the world. They have most of the poor people in the world. They will produce collectively, these 12 odd countries, uh, more than 50% of carbon in the world if nothing else is done from now to, because they're growing. So the reason these countries are important is because if these countries in transition, the world cannot transition and will not transition. So it's very imperative for all of us to think about how. And these countries face a very big existential problem. They need to grow economically and decarbonize at the same time. So South Africa, for example, right now, 30% unemployment. So they can't do things that doesn't reduce unemployment. So the question you asked of why I'm optimistic they'll act, the one of the simple facts of these countries is the following: that the fossil fuel reserve is only in three regions in the world, in the Middle East, in North America, and in Russia. So none of these countries except Nigeria actually has significant fossil fuel reserve except coal, which they all have realized is not the future. So for them, energy security means renewable energy. And that is why you see this big push from global south, these countries for enormous amount of effort. A lot of these countries are putting, not just China, India, for example, what they're trying to do, Brazil, to get renewable energy so that they energy secure. So we will see a very different voice, I think, from these countries in Belarus. Back to you, Lauren.
Great, thank you. Okay, so a few more questions here. Jennifer says the NDCs and the 5-year cycle is working, but given that countries are behind on submitting their NDCs and making them more ambitious, what is working since Paris? Do you see hope for accountability? Another question, a topic close to both of you. As you touched upon, although climate change mitigation efforts are largely heading in the right direction, the scale is not yet there. And this year in particular, we're seeing a slowing down in efforts. How can we ensure that adequate scale of action takes place and that there's sufficient funding available to support it? And what about innovative sources of climate finance? And then one more question
That's
for
enough.
now.
We can't
Yeah,
answer
okay.
more. We want
Do
to
those
remember that.
two, and we'll see if we have time for more.
I think the first question is really good. If Paris working, Jennifer, do you want to go first? I have a view on that.
Sure. I think it's working as an agreement. I think that's what I meant by if you step back and look at the institutions that have been created, the fact that countries are reporting on their greenhouse gases, that they're putting forward these plans, that the plans are more extensive, that there is funding moving forward. And also, these renewables developments didn't happen out of the blue. These happened because, at least I can speak for Europe, Europe signed up to Paris. Europe then put in place a whole set of policies and measures and EU climate law, emissions trading system, targets on renewable energy. In Germany, we had the feed-in tariff. That all came from the international and from then the Paris Agreement to then move forward to send those signals. However, the impacts are happening so hard and so fast. So that's why it's so important at this year's COP that if there is a gap, and I think there is likely to be a gap, that there is some kind of signal and process from governments, from leaders, that they're going to take that on. And optimally, they'd say by next year, we want a plan, right? And these are the elements of that. So that's, I think, quite important. And just as a innovative funding source, the one that I just want to kind of mention is a levy on private jets and first and business class flights. There's 9 countries that support that right now. And I think those are people who can afford this, and we need those 2 new kinds of sources. Back to you. Over to you, Ani.
Thanks. I just want to put some numbers to what Jennifer said. So we are not decarbonizing anywhere as fast as we need to, just to be clear from what science says that we need to. But before Paris, the world was headed to a 4-degree increase in temperature from pre-industrial level. Right now, with the policies that are in place, we're heading to a 2.8 degree Celsius, which is better, but nowhere close to 1.5 degree we need to by 2050. However, if you take all the commitments governments have made, not new commitments, just the commitments they have made, and all the commitment businesses have made, and all the commitments cities have made, we added them up. If they actually did these things that they've already politically promised to do, we would be at a 1.8, 1.7 degrees. So I just want to point out there is not just a commitment failure. Yes, there is a commitment failure, a little bit actually. What is we are failing to do is implement things we are politically already saying we want to do. And my whole book is about how do you get over that implementation failure? How do you actually get things done on the ground so that there's outcome on the ground that is politically feasible and politically supported? And I think which is very important to see this, and we absolutely need more ambition. And as Jennifer said, I think something has to happen to close the ambition gap. But we cannot forget the implementation gap. There is a whole degree plus implementation gap. We will be 75% closer to the goal. 75% closer if we just implemented what we have promised. So I just do think we have to see whether it's a commitment problem, which is a Paris, or it's actually an implemented problem. And you said about finance. I think one of the bigger failures of why this is not happening, you asked that question. I actually think for 2 things. One, I don't think we saw this. Reducing carbon from economy, as I've said earlier, is actually an enormously difficult thing to do. And we didn't actually see the enormity of the problem. And we are seeing it now as we're trying to do it. Energy actually is making the fastest change technologically, not in implementation yet. I think where we're failing, and Jennifer talked about earlier, is actually understanding the politics we need to support climate policies. And I think we all, meaning me and all of us who work in this, need to focus much more, because you can't have an economic transition without political support. You just can't. And we actually haven't focused enough on what kind of politics do we need and how do we empower our political leaders towards this transition. And if you see what happened in elections, Netherlands is a great example. Netherlands is a country where consistently public opinion, I think 4 people out of 5 are pro-climate. Yet they elected a government last year that is overtly, if not covertly, not supportive of climate. So it's a great example where politics doesn't match people's own desires in an overt way. And we need to do that. On finance, I think there needs to be a lot of innovation in finance. But also we need to recognize that public finance, or sources of public finance, which is grants or multilateral development bank, are going to be, still is, and will remain a relatively small part of the overall finance countries have to put together. It'll be a very important part because they have to finance things that the market can't finance, or poorer countries can't finance. For example, adaptation or loss and damage that Jennifer talked about. But my own focus is a lot about how do we get domestic capital aligned with climate and how do we use that domestic capital to attract private capital from other countries, other private capital, a huge amount of about 700, $800 billion private capital in our estimation has to flow from outside these the middle income and poorer countries. And that's not happening at all. Like I said, it's 3% of private capital flows to this country. So that is where I think is the biggest mountain we need to climb collectively. And I hope in Belém, as Jennifer said, finance will be a very important question. And I hope the finance is not just how much finance rich countries will provide to poor countries, which is very important, but also how do we orchestrate the finance needed for the whole of the transition. Lauren, there you are.
Yes, thank you. I think that's really all the time we have right now. If you two want to just add like maybe a closing sentiment, and but that'll be that.
Jennifer? Jennifer, are you driving?
No, I'm not driving.
She's an amazing woman. She's everywhere. Okay. Jennifer, you
Um,
go and then I'll.
I think in light of your book, Ani, the person who I really have been inspired by over the years who recently left us is Jane Goodall. And she said that hope is not wishful thinking. And she talks about how, if you see a light at an end of a tunnel, you don't just wait for it to come to you. That it is really you get hope by action. You get hope by working with others and dogged determination. And I think this is a moment where we really, all of us across all sectors, need to dig into that. And the courage piece is really important because I think right now, if you speak out about climate in some places, you get attacked. And so it requires that. That's a deliberate effort by opponents of action to try and make us afraid. So I wish everyone watching this call to know that they're not alone, that, we can move forward with hope. And we have to. So thanks so much for the conversation, Ani.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you everyone for joining. If I were to say one thing, one of the motivation for me to write this book is to want to point out that we have done enormously important and big things before, and we need to do big things together. And it's possible for us to work together. I am personally very optimistic that a very different future is possible, but none of us, can be bystanders in it. We all have to act. We have to take steps. All of us can take steps, and because it just won't go in the direction we want on its own. And I love, Jennifer, you said about Jane Goodall, whom we lost recently. And Jane so not only had courage, but had so much compassion, and so much compassion for everything, for nature, for animals, for people. And it shows that how courage and compassion can change the world. And I encourage you, and especially I hope there are a lot of young people in our listeners. I feel because WRI has a lot of young people that it seems very dark right now, and it is. I want to really read the book, have a conversation. It is actually a very different future possible, but we need your optimism for that. Optimism is kind of an engine that gets us going. So I encourage you, for all of you, to have optimism that is based on science, that all of us, at least I have, Jennifer has, I think. And I really want to thank you for joining. And Lauren, thank you for organizing this for us.
Thanks, everyone. That concludes our program. What an inspiring conversation. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, everyone, for
Bye.
joining.
Bye.
Bye bye.